Thanks, Helen. And you'll be pleased to know this is the last time you have to listen to me today. And I'm going to cover a whole lot of different issues around vaccinations and infections in Dravet syndrome. Firstly, our work some years ago about vaccine encephalopathy. Then some more recent unpublished work about whether live attenuated vaccines trigger seizures in children with Dravet syndrome. Then talk about some work we published last year, which is really important around influenza infection. And finally say, does medicine, which we help use around the time of vaccination, prevent seizures from occurring? So this was the London Times, 1993. And then at that time, the victim of whooping cough vaccine won a huge payout for what that vaccine allegedly did to the child's brain. And this child had what was known then as vaccine encephalopathy. Encephalopathy is just a long word that means disorder of the brain. And it's where you have a normal baby and they have a vaccination and they have seizures within days, and with that have developmental regression. I'm sure that will sound a familiar story to some of you. So what we did in this study, the vaccine that's always been implicated has been the combined diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis. In Australia, we call that triple antigen, so 3 different bugs, if you like, and has been recognised that it could trigger seizures. And this has led to medico-legal cases, as this Times header suggests, with significant payouts. And those families, understandably, refused further vaccines. So what we did was we found 14 patients as part of our larger study of developmental and epileptic encephalopathies, where they believed their child had vaccine encephalopathy. And we looked at them in a lot more detail, very precisely going into their early history and babies, etc. And we showed that clinically we thought 11 of the 14 patients actually had Dravet syndrome. And no, we thought 12 did actually, and 11 we then went on to show had SCM1A mutations, and that we made the point that these children were destined to have Dravet syndrome. The vaccination was a trigger to their first seizure, but they were always going to have Dravet syndrome. We then did a second study, this is back in 2010, where we looked at 40 patients with Dravet syndrome and a known SCM1A mutation. And we found, somewhat to our surprise, that a third of the patients had had seizure onset within 72 hours of vaccination. So it was very much a real deal. And we analysed those patients very carefully to the ones who didn't have vaccine-related onset, and we found that they were exactly the same in terms of their severity of intellectual disability and other features. The only difference was their onset was 7 to 8 weeks earlier. So this study confirmed that 1/3 of patients with Dravet syndrome have vaccine-related onset, and that inactivated vaccines trigger seizures in Dravet syndrome. So that's older research, 2006, 2010. This is much more recent research, not yet published, where we asked, what about the other types of vaccines, which are called live attenuated vaccines? So inactivated ones I've talked about are killed vaccines, and these live attenuated vaccines are weakened viruses, if you will. And we said, are they also a trigger of seizures in patients with Dravet syndrome? Now, the inactivated ones, as you can see in that orange bar, tend to trigger seizures within the first 3 days, and this relates to how the immunology works. When does the immune effect work? And that's why we have vaccines, to become immune to a virus or a bacteria, or what they make. And in the live attenuated vaccines, we know the risk period is 5 to 12 days post-vaccination. So in this study, we looked at live attenuated vaccines, measles, mumps, rubella, and measles, mumps, rubella, varicella, which is chickenpox. And they're all live attenuated, and in Australia, they're given at 12 and 18 months, and I suspect it'll be very similar here. And so what did we find? Well, with the first dose of measles, mumps, rubella, we found that half the patients had 26 seizures in the risk period, as you can see here, and 14 seizures in the control period. So this is putting all the patients together. And we found there wasn't a significant difference, but I suspect we don't have enough numbers. But what there was a significant difference was that when we looked at status epilepticus, defined as 30 minutes of seizing, it was definitely higher in that risk period of 5 to 12 days after the live attenuated vaccination. With the second one, the second dose of measles, mumps, rubella with or without varicella, we showed no significant difference. So in this study, we showed an increased frequency of status epilepticus, which of course is life-threatening, after vaccination with live attenuated vaccines. But we need more patients to determine whether, if you have greater numbers, do live attenuated vaccines increase all seizures or just status epilepticus? And why does it matter? Well, it tells us when we need to tell you when to worry about with your child, when to watch them more closely, when they are at more risk. So it informs your planning of vaccination and our care, and when we need to be on standby should the child have a long seizure. So you can say, well, why bother? Why vaccinate our children with Dravet syndrome, or our adults for that matter? And the problem is, and we all know this, that if the child becomes unwell, just a viral illness or a fever, they don't always go together. We know that child is at much greater risk of convulsive seizures and status epilepticus. And the problem is that if you have a vaccine-preventable illness, you can prevent them having that episodes of status. And in the image there, it's taken from our paper, where we had 5 patients who presented with a febrile illness with Dravet syndrome. This is not related to vaccination at all. And they suddenly had very severe brain swelling, and we don't know why. They've had lots of episodes of status of this 30-minute seizure, but this time their brain swelled so badly and they died. So we know that viral illnesses and febrile illnesses in our children, our patients with Dravet syndrome, can definitely be life-threatening. Sometimes you can have the same episode with brain swelling and damage, but not death. But then the child loses abilities. So it's a very, very serious problem. And so we observed in my clinic, I observed that influenza had been a major problem for some of my patients. And this led to this study about influenza. And if you look at all the children out there, the general paediatric population, there's a high burden from true influenza infection. Now, let me just say, this is not when someone says, I've got the flu, okay? We all say that when we feel a bit off colour. What I mean by influenza infection is where we have proven that they have influenza A or influenza B, of which there are many types, but this is proven influenza infection, with high hospitalisation rates of 7 to 120 children per 10,000 individuals, and neurological complications in these typical children in 9 to 20% of hospitalised children. So even in your well child, this is a serious infection. But as I'm sure everyone in the room is more than aware, we have so much vaccine hesitancy these days, and this partly relates to having had a vaccine-related seizure in a child with Dravet syndrome, and it also leads to incomplete vaccination, which is also unsafe for our children. So in this study, we looked at influenza infection in patients with Dravet syndrome. They were all children. And out of our study on whom we could get accurate data, a quarter had had influenza at some time, either influenza A or influenza B, anywhere between 6 months and 25 years. In these 21 children, there had been 24 infections, and 21 of these 24 infections were associated with neurological complications. 75% of these infections were associated with either status epilepticus or increased seizures, and most of them made a good recovery, but 21% did not make a good recovery, with a median age of infection of 7.5 years, and the outcome was of variable severity. One was a death from influenza pneumonia. It's a little girl I care for and her brother. They both have Dravet. She was more severe. She was in another hospital for 5 days with influenza. The whole family had it. And she came home and she still had pneumonia. And Mum was sleeping next to her, as she always did. She actually tried to stay awake most nights. Mum fell asleep at 2:30, and at 3:15 she woke up and her daughter had sudden unexpected death in epilepsy. So at postmortem she had pneumonia, but it was still a very rapid death, and it's more of a SUDEP death than a pneumonia death, I think. And 4 had long-term problems in terms of 2 had this brain swelling I showed you, and 1 ended up with profound impairment. And here you see patient number 2 in our series with severe long-term sequelae, which means long-term problems. And you can see on the A image diffuse swelling of the brain, so the whole brain's a bit swollen. Then you see other features with that in B and C. And then 3 months down the track in number D image, you see that the brain has shrunken following this major problem. So we showed that influenza infection is a major issue in Dravet syndrome, I think much more than COVID, as far as we know. Our patients are highly susceptible to neurological complications, be they seizures, status, but the problem I'm really worried about is this long-term damage or death, resulting in moderate to severe impairment. So it's incredibly important that you make sure your children have the annual flu vaccine, much more important than for the rest of us. Of course, you as the family members should have it too, so that you're less likely to give it to your child and to protect them from exposure. I think this just shows how important it is for us to see what we see in our clinic and then bring it back to a scientific study of, is this a real feature? And it is. And then the last study that I wanted to talk about is, can we stop vaccine-related? So proximate is just a word meaning close to vaccination. It's a slightly medical term, but can we stop vaccine-related seizures in Dravet syndrome, or can we reduce their likelihood? And in this study, we asked if we give preventative therapy with clobazam or clonazepam, diazepam's another benzodiazepine, and lorazepam's another one, so we have many we can use. Can this prevent seizures following vaccination? Can we make it safer for our children? And now in Melbourne, the children usually get admitted for the briefer ones, the inactivated vaccines, to the hospital for a couple of days, but I don't think that's routine practice everywhere. So here this study focuses on children who've had seizures related to vaccination. At the time that you would think it would be related to vaccination. And these were children managed around Australia in specialist immunisation clinics, so run by vaccine paediatricians, not by me, not by neurologists, but by paediatricians who spend their whole time in vaccination. And we asked, did the patients who'd had these seizures have further vaccine proximate seizures? And a vaccine proximate seizure was defined as within 14 days of vaccination, but again, depending on the type of vaccine. So you can see in that table, they were given benzodiazepine, this what we call prophylaxis, to prevent against seizures for 48 hours following the inactivated vaccine, or for 14 days following the live vaccine. And the encounters refer to the number of episodes in these children. So it's still a small study, and you can see the doses that were administered of clobazam or clonazepam. And what did we find? Well, we found a 30 times reduction in vaccine-related seizures, and you can see that in that middle column, where 25 of the children had no vaccine-related seizure in blue, and 1 had one with the prophylaxis in orange, compared with the right-hand bar, which are people who did not have vaccine prophylaxis. So we found that 2/3 of children who have had a vaccine-related seizure initially will be at risk of recurrence, or will have a recurrence. That recurrence is often status epilepticus without a fever. So they were very serious, life-threatening recurrences. That the preventative medication, the clobazam or clonazepam, resulted in a 30 times reduction in vaccine proximate seizures, and we recommend that this should become routine for children undergoing vaccines and vaccination. But, you know, these drugs can make the child grumpy, so it's not a small deal. It can be not great for families, but if it saves their lives, then it's worth thinking about. So, in conclusion, vaccine-preventable infections are very important to consider in children and adults with Dravet syndrome. The infections can be life-threatening or cause permanent neurological problems with cerebral edema, and we've certainly seen this with influenza infection. Vaccines do trigger seizures in a third of children with Dravet syndrome. It doesn't cause Dravet syndrome. That's due to the SCM1A mutation. It's just a trigger, like being unwell is or other forms of stress. We certainly understand vaccine hesitancy because of the increased seizure risk, but I took out the slides on COVID-19 vaccination, which were from a survey of about, I think, 200 patients from the US, and there's been a similar one done here. And the vaccine, the COVID-19 vaccine, triggered seizures in about 16% of patients, but no status. And, you know, it may be much more protective than having the infection, which can be much more dangerous. And that this preventative medicine actually reduces the risk of vaccine-related seizures. And with that, I'd like to thank the wonderful families. This is from a Dravet conference I ran now some years ago, and also my many collaborators in this study, particularly Lucy Deng and Margie Janshin around the prevention, Catherine Howell around the influenza infection, and Anne and Sam around the original vaccine studies. So thank you very much for your attention and for being with you today.